There's a unique kind of silence that only exists near a lake, not the silence of emptiness, but the kind of peaceful stillness where nature hums in the background like a living lullaby. That's the kind of place my cabin sat in. Tucked away in a quiet corner of northern woods, my family's lake cabin had been our little escape from the rush and roar of city life for 3 generations. My grandfather built it with his bare hands in the 1950s, and since then, it had been our sanctuary, a rustic wooden lodge nestled between tall pines, with a wraparound porch that overlooked a wide, sparkling lake. The kind of place you imagine when someone says, off-grid bliss. And up until recently it was bliss. I'd been coming here since I was a boy. Fishing off the dock, hunting in the surrounding forest, or just sipping coffee while watching the mist rise off the lake at dawn. This place had always been more than property, it was part of my bloodline. My grandfather left it to my father, and my father, before he passed, made sure the land deeds, boundaries, and rights were all properly secured and transferred to me. Over 200 acres of forest surrounding the lake, plus the lake itself, all legally mine. I never gave much thought to it, honestly. It was just always our place. But everything changed last fall when a newly developed neighborhood, one of those high-end Lakeview suburban enclaves, started popping up across the ridge about a mile east of the property line. I noticed the construction first. The sounds of machinery, the sudden flurry of SUVs on the gravel access roads. I wasn't thrilled, but I wasn't worried either. After all, they were building on a completely different section of land, and I had the deeds to prove it. Let them have their fancy houses and modern lake retreats. I figured we'd coexist without issue. I figured wrong. Within months, signs began appearing. Private HOA community, no unauthorized access. Then came the patrols. Volunteers from their newly minted homeowners association walking around in bright vests, clipboards in hand, giving out stern looks to anyone who wasn't from their little development. I'd wave. Most would awkwardly nod and move on. But then came her, the queen bee of their HOA, or as I came to know her, Karen. Karen was exactly what you'd expect from someone who takes HOA authority as a personal badge of honor. Platinum blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, always armed with a rulebook and a walkie-talkie. She moved into the biggest house at the edge of their gated section, the one that almost had a view of the lake, and she wasn't happy that she didn't have total control of it. At first it was small things, questions about property lines, unsolicited suggestions about upgrading the cabin, and polite but pointed remarks about how wild the woods around here seemed. Then came the first warning. I'd been out early one morning, bow in hand, doing some seasonal hunting, well within legal rights and on my own land, when she marched up, clipboard flapping, and told me I was in violation of the HOA's wildlife regulations. I laughed, thinking she was joking. I told her kindly that the HOA had no authority here. Her expression froze. We manage all lakefront activity, she snapped. And we take violations very seriously. I stared at her, speechless for a second. Lady, I said, I own the lake. Apparently she didn't believe me. Or didn't care. Over the next few weeks, I got 3 printed warnings, all tucked in plastic sleeves and nailed to trees around the path leading to my cabin. One morning, I even found one stuck to the side of my truck. Each notice was more aggressive than the last, citing made-up rules and fines for things like unauthorized wildlife tracking, improper use of lake facilities, and my personal favorite, failure to register seasonal equipment. I ignored them. I thought surely this would blow over. But Karen wasn't backing down. It all came to a head when I heard the crunch of gravel outside the cabin one afternoon and looked up to see flashing blue and red lights. 2 sheriff deputies stepped out of their cruiser. Sir, one of them said, we got a call from the HOA about illegal hunting activity in the area. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I walked them out back, showed them the property lines, the boundary markers my grandfather himself installed, and the cabin's deed, framed and mounted inside. The younger deputy nodded slowly. So you own all this? He asked. I pointed out over the water. From that tree line over there all the way around the lake and 3 miles north into the forest. Every inch. They left with awkward apologies and I thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. That was just the beginning. It was a week after the deputies left that the first fine arrived. Not a warning, not a request. An official-looking envelope slipped under my cabin's screen door, printed with the HOA's letterhead and marked Final Notice of Violation. It claimed I owed $1,450 in accumulated fines for multiple infractions, including reckless operation of unauthorized equipment, environmental endangerment, and unauthorized use of private HOA resources. At first I laughed. Literally laughed out loud. The only unauthorized equipment I owned was a 1978 outboard motor and a rusted deer stand that had been nailed to the same tree since I was in high school. As for the resources, I hadn't so much as looked at their community boardwalk or, God forbid, touched their paddle boats. I balled up the notice and tossed it in the wood stove. But Karen wasn't playing games. The next time I saw her, she didn't march up like before. She strutted in, holding her clipboard like a sheriff's badge, flanked by two men I hadn't seen before. One had a drone controller in his hands, and the other carried a camera rig. "We're conducting an environmental assessment," she said coolly, like she was doing me a favor. "We've had complaints that your activities are affecting lake quality and disturbing HOA residents." I stared at her, stunned. "You can't just walk onto my land," I said. "And you definitely can't fly a drone over it." She grinned. "Actually, under HOA Code Section B12, we can perform aerial surveys for safety and community standards." The guy with the drone fired it up. That was it for me. I walked back inside, grabbed my own paperwork, the original land deed, the full boundary survey, and the wildlife permits I kept current every year. I marched back out and shoved them into Karen's hands. "This," I said, pointing to the maps, "is not part of your HOA. Not an inch of it. You're trespassing." She barely glanced at the documents before waving her hand like she was shooing a fly. "We'll let the county sort it out," she said, turning to the camera guy. "Let's make sure we get footage of that dock. It's clearly non-compliant." Now I wasn't just annoyed, I was boiling. They filmed my dock, my trees, even my cabin. I called the county office the same day. The clerk was polite but confused. There had been no official complaint filed. The HOA, it seemed, was acting entirely on its own. "They don't have jurisdiction on private land," the clerk said. "They can't fine you." But that didn't stop the fines from coming. Over the next 2 weeks I received 3 more envelopes. One was marked Notice of Property Lien. Of course it was fake. They had no authority to place a lien on anything. But the implication was clear. Karen was trying to bully me into submission using the illusion of power. I decided to fight back in my own way. I hung trail cameras around the perimeter, posted actual no trespassing signs backed by county law, and printed copies of my land deed to hand out to any HOA inspectors who wandered too close. I even put up a small laminated sign at the start of the path to the cabin that read, "This land is privately owned. Any unauthorized entry will be reported to authorities. HOA rules do not apply." That only made Karen angrier. She showed up 3 days later, huffing like a steam engine, holding a printout of an HOA map that, surprise, now included a large shaded portion labeled Community Buffer Zone. "My land. We've updated our jurisdiction lines to include shoreline protections," she declared. "You're in violation of the revised regulations. If you refuse to comply, we'll escalate this legally." I blinked. "You updated your map to include land you don't own?" "It's for environmental safety," she snapped. "You'll need to submit an appeal form." An appeal form? For my own land? By this point, I wasn't even angry, I was fascinated. How far would she go? How delusional could this HOA get before someone in their group realized they were following a woman off a cliff? But Karen seemed to thrive on this self-appointed authority, and worse, the others in the HOA followed her. Some had even started avoiding me at the small gas station down the road. One neighbor, who used to wave at me while kayaking, now paddled in the opposite direction when I came out on the dock. Karen had turned me into a villain using nothing but clipboards and fake fines. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. The more they pushed, the more I started digging. I pulled out every old folder, every dusty binder my grandfather had left behind in the cabin's attic, paperwork that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. Maps, letters, permits, even correspondence with the state about fishing rights and water access. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just some family retreat. This land was a fortress of ironclad ownership, built brick by brick through smart planning and airtight documentation. And I was about to show them exactly how much power came with it. The phone call came on a Saturday morning. I was sitting out on the porch with a mug of black coffee, watching a pair of loons glide across the glassy surface of the lake, when my phone buzzed. A known number. I answered anyway. "Mr. Carson?" a stiff voice said. "This is Deputy Winslow from the County Sheriff's Office. We've received multiple complaints regarding unauthorized discharge of firearms and potential endangerment of HOA members near the lake area. We're dispatching officers to investigate." I almost choked on my coffee. What? That's ridiculous. I haven't fired a single shot in a week. And the nearest house is over a mile away. The deputy was polite but firm. We have to follow up on these reports, sir. We'll be on site shortly. True to his word, 30 minutes later, 2 squad cars pulled up to the old gravel turn-in near the trailhead. Karen was already there, of course, standing beside her SUV with that smug, arms-crossed posture she reserved for when she thought she had the upper hand. This time she brought backup, 2 other HOA members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, and a local news van parked discreetly behind some trees. Apparently, she had decided this situation needed publicity. The deputies approached me calmly. I remained respectful, if slightly amused. One asked if I'd been hunting that morning. I told them no. The other asked to see my permits. I handed over everything. My seasonal hunting tags, my firearms registry, my land deed, even the updated survey with GPS coordinates. They stepped aside to verify everything on their radio. Meanwhile, Karen crept closer, phone out, filming me. "This man has been threatening our community," she said aloud, narrating like she was breaking the evening news. "We've warned him multiple times. He's operating illegally on protected lakefront." I turned to her slowly. "Karen, this is the last time I'll say this nicely. You're on private land. My land. You don't have any legal authority here." She didn't flinch. "Our board has decided this area falls within our shared buffer zone, under the new Ecological Protection Act. We're backed by environmental consultants." That's when one of the deputies returned and handed me back my documents. "Everything checks out, Mr. Carson. You're well within your rights to use this land as you see fit. And the boundary lines you've provided match what's on file with the county." He then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, unless you have evidence of an actual crime, you're trespassing." Her mouth fell open. "Excuse me? I represent the HOA. We oversee this lake." The deputy didn't blink. "You oversee your neighborhood, ma'am. Not privately owned forest and not this lake. This land is not under your HOA jurisdiction." Karen's face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The news van crew began quietly packing up their equipment. One of her fellow board members muttered something about needing to check the bylaws, and walked away. It felt like a win, but I wasn't celebrating. Because I knew Karen. She wasn't the kind to walk away defeated. She was regrouping. And sure enough, she did. The very next morning, I woke up to the sound of engines. Not just one, several. I peered through the trees and saw a landscaping crew setting up equipment along the lakeshore. Weed trimmers, erosion fencing, even a backhoe. They were setting up on the east end of the lake, still on my property, near a rocky area I used for bow fishing. I stormed down there and asked who authorized the work. The foreman, a wiry guy in a neon vest, shrugged. The HOA said this was a public access cleanup. They paid for the day already. I told him he was trespassing. He packed up within 10 minutes. But I could see what Karen was doing, death by 1,000 cuts. She couldn't beat me legally, so she was going to annoy me, harass me, poke and prod and push until I either sold the land or gave in to her fake authority. So I documented everything. Every find she posted, every letter she sent, every drone that buzzed over the cabin, and every time one of her HOA agents stepped even an inch across the property line. I started a file. I even bought a trail cam with license plate recognition just to monitor who came down the gravel path. My dad always said, "Don't fight fire with fire, fight it with a lawyer." And that's exactly what I plan to do. That night, I contacted an old friend from college, now a real estate attorney in the city, and sent him scans of every document I had, including a full high-res map of the area with the original county-registered boundaries from the 1970s. He called me back the next day halfway laughing. "Dude," he said, "not only do you own the lake, you actually own the land underneath their boat launch. It's built on your plot. They're technically squatting on your property." I paused. "You mean I could?" "You could sue them into the Stone Age," he said. "Or, you could get creative." And just like that, the tides began to turn. The next few days passed in a focused haze. I put aside everything else, work emails, the broken dock step I'd meant to fix, even the trout I'd been meaning to smoke, and turned my attention to something far more important, the history of the land I stood on. If Karen wanted a war over jurisdiction, I needed more than just deeds and titles. I needed to understand exactly what I owned, how deep that ownership went, and just how invincible my legal standing really was. So I climbed up into the attic of the old cabin, flashlight in one hand, dust mask in the other, and started digging through decades of my family's paper trail. What I found wasn't just helpful, it was astonishing. My grandfather, Thomas Carson, had been a practical man with a sharp mind and a habit of documenting everything. There were old leather-bound notebooks filled with entries about snowfall, animal sightings, and seasonal flood levels. He had kept receipts from gas, ammo, timber sales, and even hand-drawn maps with annotations like "Spring Water Here" and "Property Edge, surveyed 1963. But the real jackpot was in a waterproof container sealed with wax and labeled simply, "For family use only." Inside were original copies of the land purchase from 1951, not photocopies or digital scans, but the real, typewritten, signed, and notarized originals. The land had been bought from a lumber company going out of business after World War II, and Thomas Carson hadn't just purchased the surface rights. He had purchased everything. Surface rights, mineral rights, water rights, timber rights. It was all there. Some of the clauses were handwritten in ink, initialed by both parties. Owner retains exclusive rights to shoreline access, water use, and underground mineral deposit extraction. Another line read, "Adjacent properties will be considered encroachments if constructed beyond the natural rock boundary to the east." I read that part again. The natural rock boundary to the east. That was the exact spot where Karen's HOA had placed their so-called community launch dock. That was my land. And it got better. There was also a folder full of correspondence between my grandfather and the state's Department of Natural Resources from 1978. Apparently, there had been a brief campaign to designate the lake as a protected public fishing zone, but my grandfather had lobbied, successfully, to keep it private. The reason? The lake was spring-fed and had a unique ecological profile that didn't match state fishing standards. His private stewardship, along with strict seasonal use, had kept the fish population healthier than most stocked lakes in the county. That letter, signed by the state official, included the line, "Due to Mr. Carson's ownership of the lakebed, shoreline, and surrounding woods, the state recognizes this as a private inland water body not subject to public access laws." That line was gold. If Karen wanted to throw her fictional Ecological Protection Act at me, I had a signed letter from the state saying I was the Environmental Protection Act. And it wasn't just legal ownership I uncovered, it was legacy. My grandfather had built more than just a cabin in the woods. He had built a well-defended corner of the world. He knew that land ownership meant little if you couldn't prove it a generation later. So he left breadcrumbs, photos, maps, letters, everything we'd ever need. It wasn't just a fortress of legal paperwork, it was a time capsule of intent. And that intent was clear: this land is ours. There was one more thing. In the back of a locked box, I found an envelope addressed in his handwriting, "To my heir." I opened it slowly, half expecting some poetic farewell. Instead, it was blunt and brilliant, just like him. "If anyone ever tries to take this land from you, don't argue. Don't fight in the dirt. Let them walk themselves into a hole, then bury them with paper. You own every tree, every drop of water, and every damn pebble between those ridge lines. If they doubt it, show them this." Taped to the inside of the letter was a copy of a registered land survey, stamped and filed with the county court in 1980, showing not only the lake and the forest, but overlapping outlines of where adjacent properties had been mistakenly marked in recent years, including part of Karen's subdivision. I sat there in that attic, paper spread all around me like a battlefield map, and I felt something shift. Up until now, I had been reacting, dodging blows, refuting nonsense, defending what I already knew was mine. But with this, I could go on offense. I had the power not just to stop Karen's HOA nonsense. I had the power to end it. Not with threats. Not with arguments. With proof. Real, irrefutable, legally binding proof. This was more than a fight over some lakefront rights. This was about legacy, history, and standing your ground when people think they can steamroll you with fake authority and shiny logos. Karen had no idea what kind of storm she'd stirred up, but she was about to find out. The next Saturday, I shaved, put on a collared flannel, and drove down into the subdivision. I wanted to make an impression. I wasn't showing up as the scruffy cabin guy who fished off his dock and grilled venison over a fire pit. I was showing up as the landowner. The one they'd been disrespecting, threatening, and trespassing against. I had a manila folder under one arm and a quiet smile on my face. I parked at the community recreation area, the fancy name they gave their little gravel lot, and a couple of plastic benches by the water. The HOA office, such as it was, operated out of a converted garage on the corner. The moment I walked in, Karen looked up from behind her desk. She wasn't wearing her usual sunglasses. Her face dropped a little. Maybe she didn't expect me to come down here calmly. Maybe she thought I'd just stay in the woods and grumble like some hermit while she kept writing fake fines. "Oh," she said, blinking, "Mr. Carson. If this is about the ecological compliance form, I don't think." "I'm not here for an argument," I said, holding up the folder. "I'm here to help you understand the full situation." She straightened up, trying to regain composure. If you're attempting to challenge the HOA's jurisdiction, I'll remind you that the board recently. I gently opened the folder and placed the top document on the counter. This is the original deed to the lake, the surrounding forest, and everything down to the waterbed. Dated 1951. Purchased from a now-defunct lumber company. Filed with the county and never disputed. Karen glanced at it, unimpressed. We've had surveyors determine that. I placed the next page down. Here's a registered survey from 1980, conducted by county officials, marking the legal boundaries of my property. Including this, I flipped the map, the section where your HOA's boat dock and community fire pit are built. Her face stiffened. This, I said, placing another sheet down, is a letter from the Department of Natural Resources confirming that the lake is privately owned, closed to public access, and that I retain full water and shoreline rights. Meaning, every canoe, paddleboard, and fishing line from your residence is technically trespassing. You don't need to, she began, voice tightening. Oh, I'm not finished, I said calmly. Here's a letter from the county confirming your HOA has zero jurisdiction outside its recorded development zone. Not a foot beyond your eastern border. Meaning all your so-called fines and notices to me were not just baseless. They may be considered harassment. For a long moment, the room was quiet. You could have heard a squirrel breathe outside. Karen looked down at the pages, then back at me. Her mouth worked for a moment, but no sound came out. I waited. Then I said it, Karen, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to offer you a chance to correct course. She blinked. What do you mean? I picked up one last sheet, a document my attorney friend helped me prepare. This is a cease and desist letter. It demands the immediate removal of your unauthorized dock and all HOA signage or structures on my land. It also notifies you of my intent to begin charging daily lease fees if any portion of your community continues using land you do not own. Her voice cracked slightly. That's not fair. The community didn't do this, I said, keeping my tone even. You did. You tried to enforce fake rules on someone who never agreed to be part of your association. You sent people onto my land, flew drones over my cabin, and called the police on me for legal activities. You didn't just cross a line, you stomped on it. I leaned in a little. But here's the part you should really think about, Karen. Technically, your entire HOA is now in violation of my property rights, including some of the houses that were built a little too close to the shoreline. If I really wanted to be difficult, I could pursue legal action to have them removed or start billing retroactive lease fees for the past few years. She paled. But I won't do that, I added. Because unlike you, I'm not trying to make people miserable. I just want to be left alone to enjoy what's mine, just like my grandfather intended when he bought this land long before your HOA existed. Karen sat down slowly, folding her hands together like a student being scolded. So, what now? She muttered. I smiled. Now you go back to your board and you fix your maps. You send a written apology, retract all your notices, and you never step foot across that tree line again. She didn't say another word. I turned and walked out into the bright sun, the weight of history and documentation in my hands and a breeze at my back. The game was over. But I wasn't done just yet. I could have crushed them. Legally, financially, reputationally, I had the receipts and now the leverage. But some part of me, the part that still heard my grandfather's voice when I walked through these woods, told me to handle this differently. Not with brute force or lawsuits, but with something far more satisfying. Dignified revenge wrapped in legal precision. Karen and her HOA had built their little empire on bluster and intimidation. I was going to dismantle it brick by brick, and let them feel every inch of the ground as it slipped out from beneath them. First, I sent copies of all my documentation, the deeds, surveys, cease and desist, to every member of the HOA board. I addressed them individually, politely, with a short letter explaining the situation and inviting them to recalibrate their understanding of the property boundaries surrounding Lake Hartwell. No threats, no accusations. Just facts. The kind of letter that makes lawyers sweat and reasonable people take a long pause. 2 days later, I received 3 separate emails from board members apologizing for the unfortunate confusion and asking for a clarifying meeting. I declined. Instead, I posted laminated notices at the entrance of the trailhead and by the lake's edge. Private property, access restricted. Use of this land, water, or shoreline is subject to lease terms. Unpermitted activity will result in civil penalties. The wording wasn't aggressive, but it had just enough legal gravity to make them nervous. I even bought a small sign that read "Owned and Protected by Carson Legacy Trust." which was now a real entity I'd established using my attorney friend's advice. It wasn't just me anymore. It was an institution. One that couldn't be bullied. But I wasn't done. Next, I applied to the county to have the old shoreline path, the one Karen's residents had been using for years to access the water, officially closed and rerouted. Because that path? It crossed directly through my grandfather's original survey zone. Once the county reviewed my property boundaries, they had no choice. The access point was shut down. A few weeks later, the HOA got a letter from the county clerk confirming that public access rights no longer applied. I could only imagine the look on Karen's face when that landed in her mailbox. But the cherry on top? I held an open house, a public tour of the lakefront property, and invited local press, environmental groups, and a few friendly neighbors from the nearby township, not the HOA. I called it a celebration of land stewardship, 75 years of Carson legacy. I even printed flyers and had coffee and donuts for the guests. We did trail walks, bird watching, a brief history presentation about the lake's unique ecosystem, and I gave a talk on private land conservation. It wasn't just to show off. It was to reclaim the narrative. Because Karen had spent months painting me as some backwoods hillbilly squatting on her community's natural resource. This event flipped the script. Now I was the responsible landowner, the steward, the guy who had preserved this pristine slice of nature for generations while the HOA paved over wetlands to make pickleball courts. And then I took it one step further. I partnered with a regional conservation trust and placed a portion of the land, including the lake bed and shoreline, under perpetual easement. That meant it could never be developed or claimed. I still owned it, still had full control, but now it was protected under conservation law. No HOA, no developer, no smug Karen could ever touch it again. Best part? The Conservation Trust listed it publicly as part of its network, with my name. The Carson Preserve at Hartwell Lake. It appeared in a few regional magazines, even a nature podcast. My inbox was suddenly full of thank you messages. A local school asked to do field trips there. A college professor inquired about using it for ecological studies. And Karen? She disappeared. She resigned from the HOA board 2 weeks after the tour. No big speech. No final clipboard parade. Just an email to the members saying she needed to step back to focus on personal matters. The neighborhood quieted down after that. The passive-aggressive patrols stopped. The fake notices vanished. People started waving again when I passed them in the hardware store. One guy even apologized for all that weird tension a while back. I nodded and told him not to worry. It's all water under the dock. By the time summer rolled in, the lake was mine again, not just legally but spiritually. No more drones, no fake fines, no HOA drama. Just loons, sunlight, and the sound of fish jumping at dusk. And every time I sat on that old dock watching the wind ripple across the lake's surface, I couldn't help but smile. Because I hadn't just won. I'd rewritten the rules. Summer brought a kind of silence I hadn't heard in years. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of conflict. The wind still whispered through the pines, the birds still argued in the trees, and the water still slapped gently against the shore, but the tension, the unwanted eyes, the hum of entitlement, all of that was gone. In its place was something deeper, peace. I'd reclaimed more than just land. I'd reclaimed a sense of belonging, the unshakable kind you feel when you know beyond any shadow of doubt that you are exactly where you're meant to be, and no one can take that from you. It's funny how things sneak up on you. When Karen first showed up with her clipboard and walkie-talkie, I thought it was just a petty nuisance. I figured she'd grumble, I'd ignore her, and life would move on. But that's the thing about people who crave control, they don't stop until they hit a wall. And in this case, the wall wasn't just legal paperwork. It was history. Legacy. It was the backbone of 3 generations who never asked for permission to live in peace, and never owed anyone an explanation for it. That lake had been mine since I was a kid, but somehow, it felt more mine now than it ever had. Maybe it was because I had defended it. Not with rifles or fences, but with documents, patience, and a stubborn refusal to be bullied. I'd become the protector my grandfather probably hoped I would be, though he never said it out loud. The kind of man who doesn't just inherit land, but honors it. Every once in a while, I'd get a call from someone who'd heard about the Carson Preserve. A grad student working on a wetland study. A local hiker looking for trails. A history teacher from a nearby school who wanted to bring his class for a real-life land stewardship lesson. And I'd say yes, because this land wasn't meant to be walled off from the world. It was meant to be respected, not regulated. Shared, not strangled by policies and power plays. One of the kids from the neighborhood, a boy about 10, started coming down with his dad to fish on the shore, just outside the old dock. The father knocked on my door one day, hat in hand, and asked if it was okay. "I know what happened with the HOA," he said. "We didn't agree with how it was handled. Just wanted to say thank you." I told him he and his son were welcome anytime, as long as they respected the land. He grinned. "That's how it should be." Exactly. The HOA, for its part, quieted down completely. New board members took over, younger, friendlier folks who knew their place ended where the survey lines began. They stopped pretending to control what they didn't own. The new president even sent me a letter, a formal apology on HOA letterhead. She said they were reviewing their practices, and that previous actions do not reflect the views of the current board. I smiled reading it. It was the closest thing I'd ever get to Karen admitting defeat. That was enough. I never heard from Karen again. Rumor was she moved to Florida. Maybe she's terrorizing another HOA with a new clipboard, arguing about mailbox colors or trash can placements. I wish her well from a very safe distance. And me? I stayed right where I was. Every morning, I wake up to the sound of nature reclaiming its rhythm. No arguments. No meetings. No bogus rules. Just trees, water, and time, slow and steady like it's always been. The cabin is a little older now. So am I. But the land hasn't aged a day. It still greets me like it always has, patient, proud, and just wild enough to keep me humble. Sometimes I sit on the end of the dock and think about how close I came to losing control of what was always mine. Not because I didn't have the rights, but because I underestimated how far some people will go to pretend they have power. But now I know better. Ownership isn't just a line on a deed. It's a responsibility, a promise. And when you honor it, protect it, it protects you back. That lake, that forest, that cabin, they aren't just mine. They're part of me. And no one, not even a clipboard-wielding Karen with a fake fine and a loud mouth, will ever change that.